This conference will now be recorded.
Hello, welcome everyone. My name is Brett Peterson. I'm the Director of Sales and Operations for North, Central, and South America here at Isograph. I'd like to just quickly introduce you today to our presenter, Dr. David Wiseman. He will be conducting our presentation, and he is our lead technical support here at Isograph. David's been with Isograph for over 13 years and has worked with thousands of organizations, helping their employees become very conversant with our software tools. Today, David will be showing an overview of our threat analysis tool. And so if you do have any additional questions or want to learn more from Isograph, please don't hesitate to reach out to any of us on the line here, myself, David, and as well as Clint, and there's some contact information for you. Without further ado, let's jump into the threat analysis overview and presentation. I'll turn the time over to David. I appreciate your time, David.
Thank you very much. So hopefully now you should be able to see the attack tree window. So thank you very much for the introduction. So my name is David. I work for Isograph in technical support and customer training. And today I'd like to take you through the features of the threat analysis software that is a part of the wider attack tree suite of tools. So to give you an idea of, firstly, of how that suite breaks down, Isograph's attack tree software actually is separated into several modules for different aspects of threat and attack analysis. Now, the one we'll be looking at today is threat analysis, and you can see that selected here at the top left. If I click on that menu, you can see there are other options as well for attack tree and mitigation tree. Now, these three analyses can work together, but they can also be used individually as well. Threat analysis primarily provides you with a method of ranking threats to your system by the risks that they pose, and we'll see how that works shortly. The attack tree analysis, on the other hand, looks at the various possible paths to that threat, whether they include things like attacks by an outside attacker, the failure on demand of preventative measures, and the attack tree tool allows you to determine what combinations of problems will lead to that threat. The mitigation tree looks at the outcomes of a threat. So if a threat were to occur, what are all the possible outcomes? What combinations of failure or success of your mitigating measures would lead to those outcomes? So with the attack tree and the mitigation tree, you could almost think of those as the left and right side of a kind of attack and mitigation bow tie diagram, where on the one side you have the attack tree telling you how all of these different events could lead to a threat. On the other side, you have the mitigation tree telling you how that threat could then lead to a variety of potential outcomes. But for today, again, we'll be focusing on threat analysis. So the threat analysis is focused around an asset hierarchy. You can see an example of that in the diagram here, where these blue blocks represent different assets in your system. These, for example, could be a network, the servers on that network, the client machines on that network. You can build those relationships into the hierarchy. Adding these blocks is very simple. You can add them via the add menu or via the toolbar. And at any level of that hierarchy, you can add these red blocks that you can see. These represent potential threats to those assets. So a threat to the server on your network, a potential threat to a client on the network, and so on. These threats can be ranked by their likelihood, by the level of controllability that's in place, by the consequences of those threats. And we'll see how that's handled as we go through the video today. Now, when you actually start off with one of these projects, naturally you can build a list of likelihood rankings. You can build a list of consequences that you intend to use. but it is also possible to start from one of several templates that are built into the software. So if you were starting a new project, a new threat analysis, you could just go to special functions, to templates, and you can select from one of several templates that are available: Heavens, Evita, ISO 26262. When you select one of those options and click OK, the program will automatically populate the list of likelihoods, a list of indicators, list of consequences, which can then, of course, be customized if necessary. But again, as you mentioned, you do have the custom option where you can simply build these objects yourself. So we build our asset hierarchy, populate that with threats. Now we need to try to identify what is the risk from each one of those threats. So let's take a look at an example. I will open up, let's say this one, cameras disabled by a wireless attack. Open that up. And on the first tab of our properties dialog, we can see it's possible to specify the likelihood and the controllability of this threat. Now, the likelihood is one of the places where you have quite a lot of different options for how to proceed. How do you go about ranking this threat by how likely it is to occur? Now, one option you have is to simply enter a frequency for that likelihood. How often is it likely that this threat will occur? Of course, the problem is this kind of information is very difficult to find. Where do you look to find out how likely or how often a threat will happen? So often it's more practical to look at a more sort of granular or a more qualitative method of ranking a threat by its likelihood. So rather than entering a frequency directly, you might instead choose from one of a number of likelihood rankings. Now, these you can see listed on the left here. Again, these can be created manually by the user or copied from one of the templates that we provide. If we take a look at one of these likelihoods, let's say the medium likelihood, you can see it's possible to enter a sort of maybe an upper limit of frequency for that likelihood. So maybe we expect something that could occur 10 times per year would be, say, a medium likelihood. So if I remove this now, and so we can select a likelihood manually. The third option is instead to assign a likelihood using what we call indicators. So an indicator is basically a numerical representation of how likely a threat is to occur based on one of a variety of categories or options. Now, we can assign indicators on the indicator tab. So here you can see there are four indicator options available: expertise, knowledge, equipment, and window. These categories, these options are in fact customizable. And you can see at the bottom there's a further 4 that we could use if we wanted to. So you can have up to 8 of these indicator options. Now these are defined again on the left. You can see them down here. For each one of these indicator options, you can define as many indicators as you wish. So under expertise, for example, we have a layperson all the way up to multiple experts. So that represents what level of expertise is required from the attacker in order to pose that particular threat. If we open one of these, let's say the attacker needs to be an expert. If we open that, we can see the expertise category, and we can see the likelihood level. So these are numerical values that represent, the level of expertise that's needed, and perhaps in this case, more pertinently, the likelihood level. So this is a kind of rank 2 likelihood for expertise. So that's just a ranking number that represents how likely it is that the attacker would have that level of expertise available to them. So what we can do for a given threat is just select the relevant indicators. So in this case, for example, the attacker would need to be an expert. They'd need access to critical information and bespoke equipment, and they'd have a medium level window of opportunity to perform this attack. By adding together the likelihood levels of all of these different indicators and then comparing them to the likelihood levels of these likelihood rankings, the program is able to automatically assign a likelihood. So you can see it's automatically selected low, which is kind of what we might expect. It's fairly unlikely you'd have attackers who are experts and have critical information or all of this bespoke equipment. So that's a relatively low level likelihood attack. On the other hand, if you had an attack or a threat where the expertise required was just that of a layperson with relatively little information and readily available equipment, then that might have a much higher likelihood of occurrence. So one of the things we said we could do is to basically mark the controllability of that we have in place for a given threat. So if I open up my threat again, you can see at the bottom here, we have the controllability box. Here we can specify what methods we might have in place to control that threat. Here, for example, we have a firewall in place. Now, if we go and take a look at the controllability, say the firewall, we can specify the probability that that firewall is present and up. So there's about a 78% chance that the firewall is protecting our system. It's running and it's up to date. And that can be used later when the program generates the risk. So let's go back and take a look at what we've got so far. We've been able to specify how likely our threat is, whether it's based on our own selection of a ranking or based on indicators that we've selected. We've been able to specify what controllabilities we have in place. How are we controlling the threat? What we also need to do is specify what are the potential outcomes of the threat. What are the consequences that might occur as a result of this attack, this threat to our system. That's done on the Consequences tab. Here you can see there are 10 different customizable consequence categories. We're only using the first 4, but these are defined a little bit further down on the left. So here you can see I'm using the first 4 categories. These are all customizable. So if I double click on safety, you can see I can modify the text. Underneath these, I've added 4 consequences. You can have as many of these as you want. So you can kind of customize that based on the standard you're working to or your own internal practices. If we open one of these, you can see it's possible to specify a weight, a numerical value that indicates the severity of that consequence. And it could just be a sliding scale where, say, 0 is the best case and 1,000 is the worst case, or it might represent something real. For example, your financial impact. You might have an upper limit on cost for each one of those consequences. So then, again, for each one of your threats, you can specify what the consequence is of that threat. A medium safety consequence, low financial consequence, and so on. So the program is going to use this information along with the likelihood and the controllability to determine what the risk is in each of these categories. So the program isn't just giving you one sort of generic risk ranking. You will get rankings in each of the categories that you use for consequences. You'll get a safety ranking, you'll get a financial ranking, and so on. But then, how are those rankings allocated? Well, the rankings will appear on the risk tab. But of course, where is this information coming from that we're seeing now? Well, if we slide a little bit further down, right to the bottom, you'll see we've got the risk levels. Here, I've defined 5 different risk categories or risk levels. Each one represents a risk ranking that I can allocate to a threat in each of those consequence categories. So let's look at one of them. Let's say the medium impact risk level. If I open that up, you can see I can allocate a color code just using a standard Windows color palette. I can also define risk boundaries. So in each of the categories that I'm using, I can specify the upper bound on risk. Risk is calculated by taking the frequency of the likelihood. And remember, for each likelihood ranking, I could specify an upper limit on frequency. I can take that frequency, multiply it by the weight of the consequence in the given category. And if I'm using a controllability, I would multiply that again by 1 minus the probability of the controllability. So it would be the likelihood of the wireless attack multiplied by the weight of the safety impact of a wireless attack, multiplied by the probability that my firewall is down, and that would give me the risk of that threat. The program then compares that risk to the risk boundaries for the risk levels here and selects the relevant risk level. And you scroll up and take a look at that, we can see that in each of the categories in this case, as a program has calculated the risk based on the weights of the consequences, the frequency of the likelihood, and the probability of the firewall being down. And in each case, it's found that it's just a low risk, mostly because the attack is relatively unlikely, because as far as the attacker is concerned, it's quite difficult. There's a lot of special skills and equipment that will be needed. So we would expect maybe it's quite low risk as a result of that. Now, there is something else going on in the background as we're doing all of this that's worth taking a look at. You can imagine that as we define likelihoods, as we define consequences, and of course the combinations of those things that lead to certain risk levels, there is a kind of a risk matrix in place. You select a safety ranking, you select a likelihood, and that gives you a certain risk. That matrix is actually being built automatically by the program as you define these various objects, as you define your likelihoods, your consequences, and your risk levels. And you can take a look at that risk matrix. You'll find it's under special functions, risk matrix, and you'll find that based on the rankings you've created, the program will create a matrix for each of the different consequence categories. So right now, I'm looking at my safety matrix. There are my likelihoods, there are my consequences, and at the intersection of each one, I'll find the relevant risk level. And I can look at the other rankings, other categories where those that I've used, and the program will have generated matrices for those as well. And in fact, if you've used the controllabilities, the program can add an additional dimension to that matrix. So I can go to the controllability matrix and see, that matrix then adjusted by the various controllabilities. So if there's no impact and likelihood is none, and there's a firewall in place, I can see it's QM and so on. So I've now got a kind of three-dimensional matrix based on consequence, likelihood, and controllability. And again, the program has built this automatically based on the rankings that I've built into my project. So I will close that. And maybe one other thing that's worth taking a quick look at is the grid layout. So we've seen how we can look at the risk rankings for each of these threats by opening up the dialog taking a look at the risk tab. However, we might want a slightly more convenient way of looking at that data. And there are a couple of ways to approach that we will talk about, but the first one that you'll encounter will be the grid. Now, the grid is a special type of interface. You'll actually find this in pretty much every one of Isograph's products. It allows you to view the content of your project in the form of a grid, of a table that you can filter and sort, that you can even edit if relevant. So, for example, I can say I want to take a look at my threat analysis threats. I want to look at a summary of those threats. And this grid is actually, by default, filtered by my selection in the tree on the left. So if I were to select the very highest level of my hierarchy, that will show me all of the threats underneath that. So there's all my threats listed in the grid with descriptions. It shows the likelihood, controllabilities, and so on. And you can see on the right here, it's showing me the safety risk level. And these grid layouts are all customizable. So if you, for example, wanted to add another column showing the financial risk, you could click on grid layout options, and then you can just go and find financial risk and add that to your grid as well. So you can kind of tweak this layout to give you the information you want at a glance. But of course, there are other ways of getting information out of the software. Perhaps the most commonly used, of course, would be reporting. Reports would allow you to basically pull information out of your project and lay it out in a nicely formatted table that can be then sort of pushed out to Word or to PDF or even Excel. So if I click Reports, I click Open Report, what the program will allow me to do is open a report template file, which will then populate automatically with information from my current project. So I can go to, say, results, or in fact, maybe it's better if I go to one of the others. Let's take a look at, say, just my threat risks, something very simple. Open that. And so basically the program will open the report and then populate that with information from the current project. And these reports, we provide a variety of report templates with the software, which will be enough to get you started. But of course, you can customize these reports through the design mode and even create your own reports from scratch as well. And a report like this, as we've said, of course, you can print it off, but you can also export that directly to docx for Microsoft Word, directly to PDF. And in the case of a table like this one, you can export to a text file, something like CSV, which you can open in a text editor, but of course you could also open in Excel. So the report designer is a very useful way of getting information out of the software in a well-presented, customizable format. So other ways of getting information in and out of the software, like all of Isograph software, the attack tree suite has extensive import and export facilities. Import and export you will find in the file menu. So here, for example, I can click import. And you can see here I can import and export from Access, Excel, SQL Server, a variety of text files. And basically you can completely construct a project from, say, an Excel file. It's possible to basically everything we've seen here today, you could import that from Excel. It would be unusual to do that. Usually there'll be certain information you might have in Excel that you can import into the software to get you started with your project. So you might have a list of likelihood rankings that you always use, or a list of risk levels. But this is very useful if you have data already in Excel. It saves you the time and potential error associated with entering that data by hand. You could just import it in directly. Now, maybe the last thing we'll talk about, another method of getting information into the software is through the library facility. So one of the questions we're often asked with regards to this software is, is there a library of common threats that we can use? Now, while that kind of information is hard to come across, I believe there are certain libraries out there that can be used. We don't have anything integrated with the software. However, it is possible to build your own library, whether that's by importing one of the standard libraries that's out there, or by simply building it yourself over time using threats that you've come across in your own experience. So you could build a hierarchy like this one that simply lists assets and all of the common threats you might find in those assets. And then you can basically attach that project as a library to another project and pull that information in. So I could demonstrate that here. So let's say I wanted to start a new project and I wanted to use the project we've just been looking at as a library. I could go to File, Attach a Library. We'll just go and find that project that I was looking at a moment ago and open. So there you can see the program is switched to the library view and it's showing me the contents of that other project. And I can just grab whatever I see here and drag and drop it into the project on the other side, whether it's assets or threats, whether it's likelihoods or indicators. So I might say this internal vehicle network asset, I want to use that in my new project as well. Simply drag it across and the program will pull it across with all of its threats, all of its associated likelihoods, controllability indicators, risk levels. So it's not just the assets and the threats that you get. Anything that those threats are using, like likelihoods and controllabilities, they will be copied across as well. So all of those relationships are retained. So again, you could build your own library based on your own experience or on third-party libraries you have access to, and then those will always be there for you to access and help build your projects more quickly and efficiently. So that's an overview of the threat analysis, what it does and how it works. Brett, Clint, are there any questions that you have?
Hi, this is Brett. I don't have any additional questions. I really appreciate you going through this tool. We're seeing more and more, need for it with multiple industries. And so I really appreciate it. It was a great overview. And if anyone has any additional questions, you want to reach out, you need additional training on the tool, please let us know. You can visit our site at isograph.com, as well as reach myself, Brett Peterson, at 801-610-0045. We look forward to hearing from you. And once again, thanks, David, so much for spending time with us on this.
No problem.